Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Logos Project. This is your host, Dom, on a Saturday evening. And in today's stream, I'll be giving the trads a break. Just kidding. I'm going to be talking about the errors of progressives and modernists and what people call liberals. Now, what does that mean? What does that term mean? So, we're going to look at the errors on what people, I think, unhelpfully call the left. Now, the issue is, I move in circles where all of my friends are Orthodox. I mean, usually, like, I guess some friends here and there hold to an unorthodox position, but mostly, most of my friends are Orthodox. So there isn't any like big controversy over gay marriage or women priests or contraception. Usually, when there's something we disagree on, it's going to be on the side of liturgy or um, I don't know. Rejecting the Second Vatican Council and things like that. So that's kind of why on this channel there's a lot on that topic because those are the circles in which I move and have my being, right? But I do more recently have kind of bumped into more progressive friends and people who describe themselves as liberal. And but when these are issues that I kind of already decided, I mean, kind of investigated and realized that they're not orthodox and not faithful. But the more I look at those issues on the left, and I'm going to stop using that term from now on, on the progressive side, ironically, the more I realize it's the exact same thing on the opposite side. So this is all kind of the same thing, critiquing both sides of the aisle. So what I did is I put together a little um, uh, I put some notes here on a Word document, and I'm going to go through the issue of the church caving into the world, right? It's a big problem right now. And so I'm going to talk about secularism, modernism, and progressivism. And I see all three of these things can be lumped under liberalism. So the first question is, what in the world is liberalism, right? When you think nowadays of the term liberal, you think of a Democrat who votes for the Democrat Party. But that is it's not accurate. When I'm talking about liberalism, I'm talking about it philosophically and historically, talking about classical liberalism. And I think that classical liberalism is the kind of umbrella under which it's the mother of certain children that I call secularism, modernism, and progressivism. These are the children of liberalism, you might say. So it's a critique of liberalism, is what this video is, and it's saying that a lot of the issues in the church, the kind of tendency to cave in to these issues, identity politics, and we'll talk about feminism and stuff like that. It's because of liberalism. So the first thing I'm going to do is not really an origin of liberalism because I know people are sometimes uncomfortable with like intellectual genealogies, but just to point out that you do see, especially with William of Ockham, a shift, and Ratzinger talked about this in his his Regensburg address. You have this shift away from logos, right, from truth, to the will, right, and so the power of God in His willing. And so Occam, I think, kind of represents this grand um, shift that is unfortunate and that gives birth eventually to liberalism. Now, whether that's accurate or not, like genealogically, doesn't matter because the point is that this overemphasis on the will at the expense of logos is really, I think, how you can describe the kind of the building block upon which liberalism is built. So whether we can blame Occam or not, I think we can blame Occam, but whether it's him or not doesn't really matter. The point is, liberalism is built on this building block of voluntarism, right? Of this hyper focus on the will at the expense of logos. So the first thing I wanted to say is that you see this really in this kind of redefining of the understanding of freedom. It becomes much more libertarian. It becomes a kind of freedom of choice at the expense of a freedom of flourishment, right? So the more someone flourishes, then the more free he is. So the less someone flourishes, like if you develop addictions by bad choices you make, then you flourish less and you're enslaved to things that hold you back, such as a drug addiction or what have you. And so this is kind of basic, critique of modern understanding of freedom. It's become so libertarian that we wonder why we're unhappy, right? And why we're actually not free. And Ratzinger talks about this at length, especially in what was I reading recently? Oh yeah, well actually I'm going to read it today. Principles of Catholic Theology. He in the introduction he points out that we're all happy that we have all of this freedom, and yet we're wondering why we're actually miserable and slaves. And it's because we understand freedom as libertarianism. And the connection here with the will is that it's whatever I choose, right? That's what freedom is. Freedom precedes the being of a person. But the classical understanding is that the freedom that flows from the being of that person is consonant with his flourishing. So if you have freedom prior to your being, then you get to choose what you are in a certain sense. And here we kind of see the origins of gender theory and choosing one's gender and things like that. So it's all connected. So so the first thing I want to do is talk about libertarianism, which is this I just did emphasis on the will. But what that leads to really is a kind of radical individualism, because if the individual's freedom of choice is what is the most supreme good in a society, then it becomes then what happens is that laws are legislated based on whether people infringe upon the other person's freedom. And so what happens is that we might throw out platitudes of, yeah, you should, care for people, but you can't. All we care about is that you don't infringe upon someone's freedom. So what happens that was constructed is a kind of society based on contracts and no longer based on the family, which is a covenant, right? And so things become individuals who enter into mutually agreed contracts that are enforced by law, and this is where the language of rights shows up. So liberalism starts basically with this voluntarism. It kind of creates a new definition of freedom, a kind of libertarian definition, which leads to individualism. And I'm going to argue it leads to atheism. And to do that, I'm going to read just a second here. I'm going to read from David Schindler's The Politics of the Real, the Church Between Liberalism and Integralism. Now, I know people get all up in arms about the term integralism. I'm not talking about that today, so don't worry about it. So, in the introduction to this book, David Schindler says, quote, Catholicism is not just a religion, but what we might call a real symbol, a form that unites in history the three traditions of the Greeks, the Romans, and the Jews, mediating each of these to each other and thereby giving rise to a novel whole. So, what Schindler here is saying is that religion is not merely some kind of, you know, um, set of propositions that the individual decides to assent to because he thinks that that jives with his investigation. And then he comes together with other people who came to the same conclusion and they create a club. So you have this club over here, but then you have another club over there that they have different opinions. So what you have is a kind of field in which you have different clubs with different opinions, right? And they codify them and they say, I'm part of this club, right? That's not what Catholicism is for Schindler and for the Catholic Church, right? Catholicism is, as he points out, well, I'll just turn the page just a second. It is not, oh, I lost the page. Dang it. I have to edit this out. It is not just a religion in this sense, right? What we might call a real symbol. In other words, it's a form, right? It's something that gives structure in time, in history. And he continues, it's a form that unites in history the three traditions, these three historical traditions of the Greeks, the Romans, and the Jews. And these traditions are mediating themselves to each other. It's a kind of like a perichoretic relationship, and thereby giving rise through that mediation to a novel historical whole. But it's not just historical, right? It's a form, it's a real symbol. So it's in history, but it's real. It's not just some kind of something that kind of, like a, we're going to talk about this, the whole idea of you can't step in the same river once. We're not saying that Catholicism is something that evolves with the times and kind of adapts to whatever is around it and changes in every century. So it's a real thing, it's historical, it's a form, and it mediates these three traditions and gives rise to a whole, Catholicos. Now, I want to point out that David Schindler says that liberalism, right, is basically the breaking apart of these three traditions from each other, right? So the perichoretic relationship of these three traditions is no longer possible. And, this kind of comes around the Protestant Reformation, but the stirrings in the pot were there before. But the Protestant Reformation, you see this call for Jerusalem over Athens, right? This kind of shirking of tradition and Bible alone. And so the rules of faith are being separated, and these three traditions are being torn apart. So Schindler says this undoing of Christianity and the transforming synthesis of the theological, metaphysical, and political orders its effects in history necessarily coincides with a philosophical reversal of the classical priority of act over potency, and will suggest that the resultant primacy of potency serves to explain many of the common features of contemporary life that are the sociological expressions of liberalism as a political phenomenon and theory. In other words, when you take away this historical reality of these three traditions mediating each other, and you break it apart, then suddenly you don't have what Schindler called, a whole, something that a novel whole that is the Catholic Church. What you have now is disparate groups of different people. Religion. The definition of religion changes to what I said earlier, which is these clubs agree on these propositions, but that club over there agrees on different propositions. So what happens is that what is actually true for history and for politics, so for today and for our society, becomes relegated to the individual's decision on what is true. So what is actually true becomes what is potentially true, and that potential is actualized by individuals and no longer by the whole, right? That's why Catholicism breaks apart. And that's why liberalism, Schindler strongly says, is basically essentially antithetical to Catholicism. He thinks it's demonic, quite frankly. So strong language, and I know there's different ways of using the term, and there's definitely liberals, classical liberals, who had very good ideas. I'm not saying otherwise, and so very good ideas that we can synthesize and bring into the Catholic tradition. But the fact of the matter is, liberalism is a breaking apart, right, of the Catholic whole, and it's making the actuality of the form merely potential. And now the individual actualizes that truth for themselves. So here we see how the breakdown of the Catholic Church is the rise of liberalism. Now, I wanted to point that out because what happens is that if individuals actualize the truth, then the truth itself, being merely potential, isn't actually real. So this is what creates atheism. God, for all practical purposes, does not exist unless that individual decides to believe he does, but he exists for that individual, but not for society. Because remember, the actual was replaced by the potential. So uh, I hope that makes sense. There's a lot going on there. Okay, so now into modernism. So the rise of modernism. So by the way, that was secularism, right? So this idea that we all kind of cohabitate and coexist, not cohabitate, coexist. Each religion can coexist with every other religion. That's secularism, and that's what liberalism gave rise to. We oftentimes call it secular liberalism. Now, modernism is this idea that, well, we have to update things, and there's no truth that is lasting from the past, because we're in a new circumstance, and history is really what determines what is true. And we're in a new time, therefore, truth becomes something else, something different. So for this historicism, right, notice how it again implies an anti-realism. Truth isn't actually actual, right? It's potential, and history actualizes it. So here I'm going to read Ratzinger. in his book Principles of Catholic Theology. He says a frequently recurring problem in the intellectual climate of our age is that of reconciling history with the present, of transforming the events and words of a time now past into the realities and needs of the present. So that's what we're faced with today. But the issue with this is sorry, just checking my notes. The issue with this is as follows. The old problem of being and time, which the Eleatic school, so the pre Socratics, and later Plato and Aristotle solved almost exclusively in favor of being, raises its head anew. The decisive turning point lies with Hegel, since which being and time have been more and more intertwined in philosophical thinking. Being itself is now regarded as time. The Logos becomes itself in history. It cannot be assigned, therefore, to any particular point in history, or be viewed as something existing in itself outside of history. All its historical objectifications are but movements in the whole of which they are parts. This view gives rise to two opposing positions. On the one hand, the philosophy of the history of ideas seeks to bring about a universal reconciliation. All that has hitherto been thought has meaning as a moment of the whole. It can be understood and classified as a moment in the self evolution of the Logos. In such a view, both the Catholic and the Protestant interpretation of Christianity have meaning, each in its own Protestant sorry, each in its own way. They are true in the historical moment, but they can remain true only by being abandoned when their hour has come and assimilated into that newly developing whole. So he's kind of talking about false ecumenism, right? Truth becomes a function of time. The true is not that which simply is true, for truth is not simply that which is. It is true for a time because it is part of the becoming of truth, which is the becoming. This means that, of their very nature, the contours between true and untrue are less sharply defined. It means, above all, that man's basic attitude towards reality and toward himself must be altered. altered. In such a view, fidelity to yesterday's truth consists precisely in abandoning it, in assimilating it into today's truth. Assimilation becomes the form of preservation. What was constitutive yesterday is constitutive today only as that which has been assimilated. So here he's critiquing the likes of Hegel. And I can't believe some people who probably have no idea what Hegel wrote are accusing Benedict of being a Hegelian. Yeah, right. So, he's saying here basically that historicism and anti realism is a Hegelian way of looking at truth, which is another way of saying that truth isn't something actually true, but potentially, which history actualizes in different ways, in different times, according to the needs of those times. So you lose realism in the process. Okay, let's see if we have any questions. Uh, Not too many people in the chat. Okay. This is kind of heady stuff, so it's just me reading off my notes here. Just a second. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is false ecumenism. We kind of saw. Oh, thanks for everyone. Appreciate it. Super chat. Appreciate it so much. So false ecumenism really is basically is part of what I just read, which is that this Hegelianism basically leads to, Protestantism can have its own historical meaning, and Catholicism can have its own historical meaning, and Buddhism can have its own historical meaning, etc. And we can just eventually find a way to synthesize all of them, and we'll have a new truth that is the truth because it's new historically, but history is the determining factor of truth. And so that's where false ecumenism comes from. So it's actually what's interesting is that it's the collapse of the form, right? The supernatural in a sense into the natural without any distinction. So the split that you had in certain Thomistic traditions, the lesser lights, you might say, that split between nature and grace, right, is actually what occasions I wrote it down here. The Just a second. Oh, my notes. It occasions the sanctification of the what was the sorry, just a second, guys. I'm stuttering here. Where did I put it? Anyway, it makes this the secular sacred, right? So for us to have something genuinely sacred, you need this concept of the vulgar, but not vulgar in a bad sense, but something that is not set apart, not holy, right? Something that is more common, like your work during the week, but on Sunday you set that day apart because it's sacred, it's holy, it's set apart. But what happens is that because of this separation between nature and grace in lesser lights, that occasions the forgetfulness of the sacred and actually collapses it into the secular. And so everything becomes sacred, including other religions. They all become paths to God. And so this false ecumenism is now possible. And so it's because of everything that I've been talking about up to now. Finally, we get into progressivism, and progressivism, so feminism understood as basically the desire to give equal opportunity, economically speaking, to women. um, uh, what happens is that the value of the individual is judged on economic terms, right? And so a woman who is able to get pregnant, who has menstrual cycles, all these things, these get in the way of economic productivity. Therefore, we should contraception, especially the pill, should become something that is a right for a woman, her so that she doesn't get pregnant because she needs to be on equal footing with men. And so abortion also becomes something that makes sense in this logic, right, for women. So this kind of feminism is a reaction to um, the vision of man as merely an individual and not as man and woman. So the destruction of a gendered world creates the possibility for this kind of competing on in the same field, right, between men and women. They're no longer men and women. They're just economic individuals, right, whose value depends on equal opportunity and equal output. And so what happens? The woman loses. And so we start to champion abortion, contraception, and things like that to make sure that they're equal with men. So, New Polity is a really good resource in this area. If you check out their gender series, it's really good. Um, let's see, and we'll talk about women priests in just a second. But I see that River has question here. Why isn't it? Why isn't that wrong if we are considering the providential meaning of even evils? It's not as if God does not have a providential purpose for other religions, even if they are not correct. Um, I'm not sure what you mean by even evils, but I do think that, God allows other religions and there's good in them. One way that David Schindler puts it is that, what liberalism does, it takes the true religion, it takes that actuality and it makes it into a potential, which undermines the whole edifice. But what he does say is that actually other religions are in a position of potentiality to Catholicism, which is that actuality. And so the good in those religions can be actualized by the whole, by Catholicism. So you see how you have the inverse with liberalism and then with Catholicism. So in fact, people want other religions to be treated fairly, you might say. Well, it turns out it's in the liberal paradigm that they can't be, but in the Catholic paradigm that they actually can. So that's a deep irony right there, I think. Um, let's see. Yeah, no, I agree, River. So, in other words, it means to me on one reading to be no more a problem than saying that your past life of adultery and the death of your loved ones has an ultimate meaning in the providential action of God. Yes, God draws, everything's part of his providential plan, and he wills it either permissively or actively. Okay, so I want to read something else real quick, but so I'm going to link to a video by Christopher West in the show notes. And I know some of my friends are uncomfortable with Christopher West. They don't like the way he presents the theology of the body. Myself, having read the theology of the body, I realized that he's, especially at first, was popularizing it, especially for younger people, like chastity talks and things like that. And so, there was a controversy over it, but as time went on, he changed a lot his presentation, and I find his content, especially his more recent content, to be really exceptional. Even though maybe I might word things differently, but it doesn't bother me. It bothers my friends, which is why I'm trying to be diplomatic about it. But anyway, so I'll link to the video. But he's talking about women priests, right? And in this video, he makes this excellent point that when it comes to women priests, we have to realize, first of all, that grace builds on nature, right? So priesthood isn't just an economic career. Remember what I was saying about the destruction of gendered worlds and value of the individual being determined by economic output or equal pay or equal opportunity and things like that. So priesthood is not a career choice, but it's actually a genuinely real fatherhood, right? It's not a career choice like plumber or mathematician or book writer, right? It's actually a very real fatherhood. So you don't get to just choose to be a father or choose to be a mother. The reality of things determines that. Now he explains that the woman gives grace. In other words, she's the conduit of grace through her ability to give birth. Man is the conduit of grace through his ability to inseminate, right? And so God, and we see this throughout the Old Testament, but it comes to a climax in the New Testament. God speaks the seed of His word, right, into creation, and Mary, as the archetype of creation, hears, think of the Annunciation, right? She hears that word and she conceives of it in her heart and in her womb, and she bears that fruit. Think of the Hail Mary, right? Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with you. Blessed are you among women, and blessed is the fruit of your womb, who is Jesus, the Word, the seed of God, right? And so the capacity for spiritual fatherhood presupposes a capacity for biological fatherhood because of this principle that grace builds on nature, as Christopher West lays out very beautifully. And he also points out, and the video's in the show notes again, but he also points out this interesting fact for you nerds out there that the 1917 Code of Canon Law says that castrated men cannot be made priests because they don't have the capacity, the ability to be fathers, right? It doesn't mean that they will be biological fathers, but it means that they will be spiritual fathers, and that they have to be fully able, and grace builds on that nature. Now, he also points out this fascinating point that the word seminary, the etymology has to do with sowing seed, like think in a field, right? And there's also those implications that you can think of for sexuality. Now, again, this goes back to the work of New Polity, which is they point out that there were such things as gendered worlds, but I find fascinating, if you've been listening to everything I've been talking about, that the breakdown of the Catholic form, right? In this rise of liberalism and this rise of individualism and voluntarism, all of these things, what it does is it breaks apart gendered worlds, and it breaks apart gender, right? And so what happens is that because of the Protestant Reformation, as things move along, there what happens, what this appears is the female world when it comes to religion, right? There's no more convents, no more nuns, no more mother abbesses, right? All that goes away with Protestantism. I know Catholicism kept it, of course, and we still have it. But that's the thing. In Catholicism, you have these gendered worlds in liturgy, in religion, and in life, and so that's why being part of this secular world is so corrosive on our Catholicity, how we live it. And so a man cannot become a nun and a woman cannot become a priest. It's much less problematic when you have those gendered worlds, right? So it's no longer a thing about oh, equal opportunity. If you can do it, why can't I? It's because that presupposes they're on the same playing field and one loses to the other. That's the issue with women priests, right? It's a misunderstanding. It's not misogyny or sexism. In fact, assuming that people are in the same playing field actually becomes sexist because it denigrates the woman where she tries to become more like a man by having access to abortion, contraception, and which takes away from her activities as a woman to make her more like a man so she can compete on an equal plane. So I hope you guys see that, and I find that interesting. Excuse me. Okay, so and what's interesting is we talked about nuns being spiritual mothers, just like priests are spiritual fathers. So it really does come down when it comes to the priesthood to the essential act of the priest, as Christopher West points out, which is the conferring of the Eucharist. Now think about it. The Eucharist is the sacrament of the union of Christ with his church. The Eucharist is the bridegroom giving his flesh to the bride, and the bride receiving the flesh of the bridegroom. And so you see here that the person who is taken out of the assembly of the church, of the woman, right? Taken out of the assembly is meant to represent Christ in his giving to the woman, right? So you have this masculine, essentially, it's not just a symbol because there's a real metaphysical act of the giving of the flesh of the bridegroom to the bride. So the bridegroom gives the seed that leads to new life, right? Eve comes from his side, you might say. But the bride conceives and bears life, as we see with Mary. She bears the church in her womb. So it's really the liturgy of gender which affirms the dignity of the woman, right? Of the church, really. So what's interesting is Christopher West also brings up. People say, well, in baptism, women are priests, and men are part of the church, so are they're women in a certain sense, and that's a good point. So here's the thing: in baptism, women share in the priesthood, right? And in baptism, men share in the bridehood of the church. But the set apart individual, right, who is a sign of Christ, alter Christi, right, gives the church flesh, right? He's a man. But the set apart individual, who is the sign of the church, think of nuns, right? They bear more children and they're spiritual mothers. That's the woman, right? So you have this gendered world here that actually is the only way to genuinely value and affirm the beauty of both worlds and of both genders. And it doesn't discriminate. It's not sexist. It's not misogynist. It's in fact this destruction of gendered worlds that ends up becoming misogynistic and sexist. It's again another paradox, right? And this is because of the breaking apart of Catholicism and the rise of liberalism. So that's what we're facing in the church today. Many people don't understand the language of the church anymore. Even those who are part of the church, even some which remain nameless, we will pray for them and not make videos naming them and going crazy on them. But even some who are in charge, they need our prayers now more than ever because they have forgotten how to understand the language of the woman, right? They're the shepherd, they're the Saint Joseph, and the church is Mary, and they've forgotten the language between Mary and Jesus, the child Jesus, right? And so it's going to be hard to protect if you can't communicate with the woman and the child. So okay, so let's see. We're gonna get into some liturgy questions. Okay, we got some questions in the chat here. Yeah, I wanted to bring this up, River, to say that X has a purpose in God's providence, so like another religion, right? Is not to say X is actually good. Is the point? That is the point. Yes, and there's the seeds of the word that the actual form of Catholicism can draw out, can actualize from that religion. Um, okay. Oh, let's see. Yeah. So, Zach, yes, Christopher West acknowledged issues with critiques of his presentation of Tubi. Yeah, he did. Yeah. And he's taken these on board and adapted it. I have noticed that. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. He's a humble guy, and it's a needed message. So the more spreading of TOB, the better. No, I absolutely agree. Yeah, absolutely agree. No, I'd be honored to have him on the show. I don't think it'll happen. He's kind of a up there in the Catholic media world, but I would absolutely be honored to have him on. Um, what role does nominalism play in liberalism? This gets debated a lot, and there's actually people like to blame SCOTUS, right? And there's people that have been pushing back on this. And I've heard good arguments that do blame SCOTUS. They sound convincing the way it's laid out. But here's the thing, like, I actually have not read SCOTUS, and I want to believe that those defending SCOTUS are correct. So I am 200% open-minded here that SCOTUS is not at all to blame. In fact, the only actually, I have read a little bit of SCOTUS when I was doing research on the Immaculate Conception, and it was beautiful. I really liked what I read. So I want to have my mind change. I have heard arguments that say SCOTUS kind of started, he kind of had the ball rolling. And they, the way I read them, they sounded good. It was coherent, but I've not read SCOTUS, and I hope I'm wrong. In fact, I think I'm wrong. I just want someone to come and tell me how. So I don't want to blame SCOTUS because I think he's a giant. So, but Occam, I think everyone agrees, went off the rails. So I will lay the blame at Occam's feet, not SCOTUS, because I'm not I'm not qualified to say that. And I people that are very intelligent have told me this is not the case, and so I'm going to defer to them. Hope that helps. Thanks, Rachel. Appreciate it. Yeah, so this is what I was talking about, right? City of the Immaculata. Have you spent any time with SCOTUS on the will? No, I have not. I'd like to. I'm just so busy in, class on my last semester. I feel like he finds the mean between secularity and secularism on being neutral and on being evil. Interesting. I'd like to hear that. Yeah, that'd be interesting. All right. Okay. So let me see if I can recap some of these things here. I do want to talk more about. We covered that the three main progressive, you might say, liberal issues in the church today, which unfortunately a lot of people are kind of caving into, are secularism, right, which is kind of this libertarian individualistic atheism, right? Modernism, which is a kind of historicism that denies truth and its realism, and creates a false ecumenism, right? And finally, progressivism, which destroys gendered worlds and gives rise to a form of feminism that actually denigrates the woman, right? And promotes women priests in a misunderstanding that, they're missing out and it's not fair, when, in a certain sense, what isn't fair is that women don't have a realm in which to have authority. That's been taken away by, and I want to fully blame it, but by the Protestant Reformation. It actually, I think, did do damage to women. And so the solution to the damage done to women isn't to say, well, now become men or become priests, but to say, to rekindle and to rebuild through a symbolic dance, you might say, a kind of code, as Dr. Mark Barnes said, a code of honor and shame, right? To build this world for women where they can be fully women in all of the glory of their femininity. It's that we as Catholics need to do, because we live in a world where gender has been destroyed and it's not fair. So so progressivism pushes for these things like women priests, contraception and abortion, again, because they want to be equal to men in the output in the economic world, blah blah blah. Now, notice how what this has done is destroyed gender. And it's, we talked about this kind of libertarian freedom where you get to determine for yourself what is, between choices. Well, what do you have when you take that libertarian freedom and you take the destruction of gender? Well, you have the rise of gay marriage, right? So in this issue is actually really interesting. There's an essay. Just a second, let me delete this. There's an essay here that I brought up by Michael Hannon from March 2014 in First Things. And the title is ironic. It's called Against Heterosexuality. So I'm going to read just the beginning of it, just a couple paragraphs. It's really interesting. And so Michael Hannon says, Alistair MacIntyre once quipped that, quote, facts like telescopes and wigs for gentlemen were a 17th century invention, end quote. Something similar can be said about sexual orientation. Heterosexuals, like typewriters and urinals, also obviously for gentlemen, were an invention of the 1860s. Contrary to our cultural preconceptions and the lies of what has come to be called orientation essentialism, straight and gay are not ageless absolutes. Sexual orientation is a conceptual scheme with a history, and a dark one at that. It is a history that began far more recently than most people know, and it is one that will likely end much sooner than most people think in the grand scheme of things. And he continues this second paragraph here. Over the course of several centuries, the West had progressively abandoned Christianity's marital architecture for human sexuality. Then, about 150 years ago, it began to replace that long standing teleological tradition with a brand new creation, the absolutist but absurd taxonomy of sexual orientations. Heterosexuality was made to serve as this fanciful framework's regulating idea, preserving the social prohibitions against sodomy and other sexual debaucheries without requiring recourse to the procreative nature of human sexuality. And then the last paragraph I'll read, maybe two more. On this novel account, same sex acts were wrong not because they spurned the rational animal purpose of sex, namely the family, but rather because the desire for these actions allegedly arises from a distasteful psychological disorder. As queer theorist Han Blank recounts, this new concept of heterosexuality, gussied up in a mangled mix of impressive sounding dead languages, gave old orthodoxies a new and vibrant lease on life by suggesting, in authoritative tones, that science had effectively pronounced them natural, inevitable, and innate. So you see here that ironically, the issue is heterosexuality, right? Sexuality has been, the kind of the framework of the Christian marriage and its form and telos, right, have been set aside, and what's now been being talked about is orientation essentialism, where you are essentially right what your orientation is. And so, and but that applies to heterosexuality. So there is no such thing as a heterosexual or a homosexual. There's just men and women, and sexuality, right, is the expression of uh, gender, basically, in its telos towards the family, you might say. Okay, John Dolph is taken off, so he's got a question. Have you seen my question on your last video about whether John Salsa has addressed the claim that because Pope Francis signed filet to an office that it shows they've been regularized? Uh, I didn't see your question. Sorry about that. Yeah, that's something that we brought up in one of our videos. I can't remember where it is. It's one of our videos at the end. We bring it up. The thing is, like that's been going around for a long time, and several of us over the years, no, excuse me, asked for evidence, right? A documentary evidence of this, and no one has been able to produce it. And but let's just say it's true, which I hate to say it. I guess I'm saying that it's not. It doesn't look like it's true, because again, several people have asked for documentary evidence, and no one has provided any of it. Anyway, and even if it's true, though, you know, it, it doesn't it doesn't regularize the status of priests that are not incarnated, or of bishops that have not recanted, their position towards the primacy and the Second Vatican Council. So it's kind of regard. It doesn't really affect the situation, if that makes any sense. But maybe I'll ask John, because that's just off the top of my dome, and he's the one that knows more about that stuff. Okay. Oh yeah, yeah. Yeah, Rachel Wilson. Yes. Can you link to that article on heterosexuality after the show? Absolutely. I'll include it in the show notes. So I'll go ahead and put Christopher West's video on women priests and that article on heterosexuality. Now, what I find fascinating is those are two examples of what really frustrates me with Catholics. What really frustrates me is that the answers we give to the questions of progressives and liberals are almost all the time very, very bad. Um, unless you dive deeper into certain Catholic academics. But that's why, again, I appreciate Christopher West. He's able to take this really profound theology of John Paul II and distill it and make it comprehensible and accessible, right? And you'll notice in the video he says the same thing I'm saying right here, which is that someone said, "Well, why can't you have women priests?" And the Catholic will answer, "Well, Jesus set up men, and the church said so, and sorry, women." It's like, that's an awful answer. Give an answer that actually makes sense of what the Catholic Church has always stood for, which is genuine freedom, genuine love, genuine equality, genuine dignity, all of these things. So how does the Catholic truth make sense of the very things that the Catholic Church cherishes? Is she being contradictory? That answer of the Catholic is an answer that doesn't lend credibility to the Catholic witness. It shows that the church is contradictory, unless you give an answer like Christopher West does in that video. That shows you that no, it's because of all of these values that we, at least superficially, most people actually share with the progressives and the liberals. It's just that they don't realize the inconsistency, and they don't understand why this kind of sexual freedom makes you miserable, because they're thinking, well, if I'm free and there's no laws to oppress me, then I should be happy. Why am I not? But they can't really explain that. But us, we shouldn't say, well, it's right and it's wrong and that's it. It's like, well, no, right and wrong have to do with happiness. And so if we can show how that works, then that actually lends credibility to evangelization, to the Catholic claims. And that's what we need to see. And that's why Catholics need to learn their faith. And yeah, so I'll leave it at that. All right. So I hope you guys can see here that I am frustrated, to put it mildly. Usually off air, I'm much more angry about some of these things. I'm frustrated with this misunderstanding, this push for women priests, just fundamentally misunderstands, what the church teaches, because the church does in fact have people's happiness and dignity in mind, and that's why we don't push for things that would create, unhappiness. So that's the thing about women priests. Same thing about sexuality in gay marriage. You see how the progressives are saying, well, they don't think it's fair that y'all get to get married, but they don't. It's like, how does that make any sense? On the surface, I'm like, oh, okay, yeah. So, and the answer isn't, well, sodomy is wrong. That's true, but like, don't give that answer. A better answer is that, well, we live in a world that gender has been destroyed. Worlds have been destroyed, and if we engage in this kind of libertarian sexual freedom and redefine marriage, it's going to create misery and unhappiness. That's why we're against it, because we're for happiness, we're for dignity, not because we want to oppress a minority. You see that? So, that's for that. And again, kind of going backwards here, historicism and anti-realism with the whole modernist thing. Benedict, as I read, kind of points to this kind of Hegelian um, diminishment of the objectivity of truth, right, by historicizing it. And finally, secularism, which started with this kind of voluntarism, that the rise of liberalism, right, that created a de facto society of atheism. That's what we live in, and that's what the 1958 article by Joseph Ratzinger, which many people keep bringing up, which is good because it's an excellent article. Read it. I'll link to that one in the show notes as well. That's why he says in that article that the church has become pagan. And that's what explains the chaos after the council. So I hope that makes sense. So, okay, so that's for all of these progressive and liberal complaints that I have with the church. And notice I'm not naming names. And I think we should stick more to teaching and praying for people who dissent, but not making videos, just bashing on them. I don't see how that makes things better. Uh, Maybe someone could enlighten me in the com box. But now I want to talk about some of these principles, how they show up in the liturgy. And that to me is important. And because I think that if we want a reform in the church, it has to start with the liturgy. I was listening to Catholic Answers. They were doing a tribute to Pope Benedict XVI. I think this was aired on the Saturday that he passed. And in it, it was Joe Heschmeyer at the end talks about how, Pope Benedict was called the Green Pope because he was very big on environmentalism, right? Well, here's the thing. Pope Benedict harked on the threefold relationship of man with God, man with man, and man with nature or creation, right? And so, in other words, another pithy way to put it, as I think Joe Heschmeyer puts it, is that the environment question and the pro life question are inseparable, they're intimately tied, right? And the reason why is because, what are they tied by? The liturgy question. So let me say that again. The environment question, right? This consumerism, this destruction, and this lack of responsibility of being a priest and a steward, right? This has to do with, economic liberalism again, right? So, and this rampant individualism and selfishness and consumerism. So, the environment and the dignity of life, the pro life question, what ties these two things together is the liturgy question, right? And so, all three are massively important, but guess what? We start with God and things flow from there naturally, right? And I'm using that term as in like not forced because it's supernaturally that it flows. But the point being is that if we focus on a liturgical renewal within the Catholic Church, then the Catholic faithful will be able to witness to the world in the dignity of the human person and against the consumerism of liberal economy, which destroys the environment, right? So the solution to the environment question isn't these hypothetical things about we should do this, and that, the kind of recycling stuff. And I don't even know how that works. I recycle because it's there, and I do what I told, whatever. The solution really is the liturgy. Isn't that interesting? That it's not political activism that fixes the way we treat the environment, but it's prayer, it's worship, it's liturgy. That you want to care about the environment, care about the liturgy. Notice how I'm talking to the progressives here and the traditionalists, you might say. So I'm telling the traditionalists, like, don't weaponize the liturgy because what you're doing is creating division. And without division, then communion loses its meaning. And what happens in division is that something that another group is supporting, you can't support because the other group is supporting. So, not all some traditionalists are, good, good with the environment, you might say, but oftentimes I've seen amongst my friends. So I'm not judging all of them. I can't do that, but I've seen with my friends that a kind of conservative political stance associated with disdain for the environment, right? Thinking it's all kind of conspiracy theories and stuff like that. Is it comes hand in hand with the kind of weaponizing of the liturgy. Anyway, and on the other side, to the progressives, I'm saying if you guys really do care about the environment, you need to start shaping up the liturgy yourselves and how you pray at the liturgy, right? So if you really care about the environment, look at the liturgy first. So I hope you guys can see those connections there. Am I rambling? I don't know if it makes any sense, but Zach here says something. But it has to be true because some say that an anonymous person claimed to have found these documents about regularization in a briefcase. They lost it later, so don't ask evidence for this proof. Yeah, speaking of who was it? I think it was John Dalf brought up earlier. Yeah, no, look, if this is true, we'd like the proof. It still wouldn't change anything, but if it's true, then give us some documentary proof. It's funny because and it's been requested and it hasn't been given forth. Okay. Um, so liturgy. Okay. Liturgy. Speaking of liturgy and environment and pro-life and sexual ethics and women priests, what I want to do is read from. Now I know he got a bad name for himself recently because of some drama in church politics, and I think that he went overboard and he shouldn't have, and I stand by that. But again, if an atheist makes a good argument, you look at the argument, right? The genetic fallacy doesn't rule anyone out. So I'm talking about Aidan Nichols. I like his writings. Recently, I won't, talk about this too much, but he did something he should not have done, I think, and I understand his frustration. But anyway, you guys know what I'm talking about if you know who I'm talking about. Anyway, so I'm going to read from Aidan Nichols on the Second Vatican Council in his book Conciliar Octet, and this is what he says, and this is the crux of what I'm getting at when it comes to our parishes and I'm not blaming certain generations because I hate when the kind of younger zealous generation starts blaming all those boomers. It's like there's a reason why they act the way they act and believe the things they believe. And they haven't really looked into it. Kind of like a lot of my trad friends haven't really looked into the council or liturgy or the SSPX, for example. And then they realize, oh, I actually don't know what I'm talking about, right? Same thing with the boomers. And that's kind of a derogatory term, I guess. But um, I'm not blaming them. I hate when people just say, well, it's all because of them, and that's why we're in a mess. It's like, I prefer to blame myself, right? I think if us young people, us zealous young people, started blaming ourselves and praying more and doing penance, I think that would make a difference. Blaming the boomers isn't going to make a difference. They were in a historical context that created these problems. So this is what I'm saying. If you are of the elder generation, hear my words, hear what I'm saying, and I think consider approaching this topic with more clarity, doing more research, and listening to what the church says, regardless of some bad experiences in the past. And I try to apply this criteria to myself as well on all levels. That caveat being said, I'm going to start reading from Father Nichols's book. He says, Chapter 1 on interpreting the council. I'm only going to read a few paragraphs. For the church historian, a study of the Second Vatican Council inevitably means a contrast between the preconciliar and the postconciliar church, to use the vocabulary against which Pope Benedict XVI sought to warn Roman Catholic Christians. This is the more so if, as sometimes happens, a coarse description on the topic emphasizes the event character of the council, the event of Vatican II, or the conciliar event. Is this context, sorry, in this context, event is a term typically invoked by the Bologna school of writers because they're baloney. So that is those associated with the Center of Conciliar Documentation and Research that was founded in that Italian city by the noted church historian Giuseppe Alberigo. Okay, it might seem innocuous to refer to the Second Vatican Council as an event. But in the hermeneutic, or in plainer English, manner of interpretation favored by the Bologna school, the word carries quite a load of ideological baggage. For that school to call the Second Vatican Council an event is to say that the texts produced by the council are not necessarily the most important thing about it. The texts are only one factor, and not the determining one at that. They take their modest place in a complex happening in which is included the reactions of public opinion to the presentation of the texts and the process that led to these texts. So the media, right? This is what de Lubac called the paracouncil. It was, after all, that reaction, media driven, but that is how the modern world works, which determined the reception of the council by the wider church. So-called reception theory is crucial to the Bologna school approach. Originally, reception was a concept used by legal historians seeking to explain, among other things, why some laws fall into desuetude while others remain in vigor, notwithstanding the equal status of all laws at some given time and in some given place. And the last quote I'll read here, well, here's one I'll read real quick. He says, this ignores a crucial distinction. In regard to councils, validity is one thing, fruitfulness is another. If a council has authority to teach, then its promulgation of doctrine is valid. Reception does not confer validity on what councils teach. Yet, no council can guarantee that its message will be heard, treasured, interiorized, and acted upon. In a word, that it will bear fruit. Reception shows what fruit a council's teaching has subsequently achieved or not achieved, as the case may be. That's my point, is that unfortunately, the older generation, it's a trend I've noticed, it's the trend that I've noticed, tends to think of Vatican II as an event that we need to move forward. It's a hermeneutic of rupture, and that the text, they have a role to play, but it's not the primary role. The primary role is the event of Vatican II. What I'm saying is that, and he gets into how this has been a theory, thought about the reception theory, by Eastern Orthodox, and I think on Michael Lofton's channel, he talks about the various criteria for what makes an ecumenical council, right? And this is one of them, reception theory, but it doesn't stand to either logical consistency on the councils that we have or historical witness. So, but the point that Nichols is making here is that we have to give priority to the text, regardless of the fruitfulness of the council or not. And so I would encourage people to stop using the council as an event to justify ignoring the texts. And on the other hand, the traditionalists will have issues with the texts. To which, I would say, well, I have issues with your issues with the texts. And then we could talk about that, right? Um, okay. Um, Let's see. Conlive says you should do a show about eschatology. End time theology is fascinating. I would love to hear your take on origin and the apocatastasis. Uh, yeah, I might do a show based on Ratzinger's book Eschatology. Um, if anyone's curious and who, because universalism is a topic that gets a lot of people heated, and people like to argue about it. And some say the church hasn't fully condemned it if you mean it this way. Blah 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 blah. If people want to know what I think about the hell question, well, all you have to do is read Spe Salvi by Pope Benedict XVI. So that will set the record straight. Okay, now Vatican II as event, which goes beyond in a rupturous way, right? As Nichols said, is not the way we should approach things. So I would entreat people who use this argument to drop it. Now, here's another thing that I want to point out. In Joseph Ratzinger's book, The Feast of Faith, he warns that people, liturgy is not to be made in our image. And so he says here, it follows that liturgy has a cosmic and universal dimension. The community does not become a community by mutual interaction. It receives its being as a gift from an already existing completeness, totality, and in return, it gives itself back to this totality. Liturgy cannot be made. This is why it has to be simply received as a given reality and continually revitalized. This is why its universality is expressed in a form binding on the whole church, committed to the local congregation in the form of the rite. As feast, liturgy goes beyond the realm of what can be made and manipulated. It introduces us to the realm of given, living reality, which communicates itself to us. So we need to focus more on following the rubrics. This is when Pope Benedict in his encyclical. No, it was a. I think it was a. I don't think it was an encyclical. Maybe it was Sacramentum Caritatis. Maybe it was. I can't remember. But in it, he talks about the ars celebrandi, the art of celebration of the priest, um, and he says that if you want to know what the church expects when it comes to the proper ars celebrandi, then the church expects you to simply follow the rubrics and do nothing else than that. So I would entreat, and I'm a little voice on YouTube, and I don't even know if priests watch the show. I know Father Brown does, so but I'm sure he already does this. But I would entreat other priests to just follow the rubrics. That's it. That's all you need to do. No improvisation or adding things. Uh, the sermon is the place where you're able to do catechesis, but it has to be an explication of the readings. So So I would entreat priests, to do that. It would make us happy as people trying to be faithful. And yeah, so Uh, and I think all this is related to progressivism and liberalism because it's the principles I spoke of in the beginning kind of being applied in the liturgy. So, reform of the liturgy will spread out, you see, and undo these principles in our lives. And so, I know ignoring the letter of the council in the name of a spirit which is not consonant with the council, stop doing that. Justifying liturgical aberrations with an appeal to Vatican II, same thing. That's no, stop. In fact, us people who don't like that, we should start quoting Vatican II to improve the liturgy, to make arguments to improve the liturgy, instead of saying Vatican II is bad. It's like that's the okay. This stream is not about trans, okay, but that is the productivity there. Anyway, mistreating. So yeah, misunderstanding gender as equal opportunity in a way which goes against the sexual difference. We don't want to do that. Misunderstanding marriage, promoting things contrary to the church's explicit teaching in the name of Vatican II. That's a big. It keeps coming back up because people do this all the time. Don't do it. Follow the rubrics when it comes to liturgy, and follow the documents when it comes to the to councils and to the church's teaching. And so much of this would go away. Um, and don't have an allergic reaction to Latin Gregorian chant in silence because the Second Vatican Council calls for it. And that's often used. I know that, but it's true. And Pope Paul VI, I don't remember the title of it, had a little letter where I think he gives a list of hymns that can be sung for the Mass of Pope Saint Paul VI. I'd have to look that up. I'll put it in the show notes. Now, finally, ad populum versus ad orientem. Uh, all right, I'm just gonna straight up read Ratzinger for this. But here's the thing. Um, I get why it happened. Let me just delete this here. Oh, let me first answer some questions here. Um, Never mind. So that's all there is. Okay. All right. Well, so here's why we face east, and I would encourage priests. If your bishop says you can't do it, you know, obey your bishop, of course. Um, so I guess this is directed at bishops, and we should pray for our bishops. We really should, especially when it comes to this question of liturgy. We should pray that they, because if you look at the masses said by bishops, at least the ones I've seen recently, they're usually said very well. It's usually in local parishes where there's chaos, right? And there's not, things are much better now. But pray for your bishops that they might deepen their liturgical devotion, their Eucharistic devotion, right? And I think a lot of good will come from that if our bishops are deeply devoted to the liturgy. So pray for that, I would say. But if you have the permission and you're able to, and because ad populum, there's nothing intrinsically sinful about it. It's not ideal, but if you can, and there's nothing impeding you from doing this, if you're a priest, consider, and I know there's the elder generation in the congregation that you have to make sure you don't anger, but consider facing east. That would do so much good. All right. Ratzinger says, despite all the variations in practice that have taken place far into the second millennium, one thing that has remained clear for the whole of Christendom: praying toward the East is a tradition that goes back to the beginning. Moreover, it is a fundamental expression of the Christian synthesis of cosmos and history, of being rooted in the once for all event of salvation history while going out to meet the Lord who is to come again. Here, both the fidelity to the gift already bestowed and the dynamism of going forward are given equal expression. Excuse me. Notice earlier in Feast of Faith his critique of making the liturgy, but we receive it. But here he says, but in the Adorientem posture, there is that dynamism coming from the community of being pilgrim people walking in hope towards the rising sun, which represents the second coming of the Lord. So I was gonna read this whole this whole section. I'm not going to. It's already an hour and 10 minutes. But ad orientem is something that we need to recover. The church never formally legislated it. Legislated it. Yeah, that's right. And so I'll conclude with this passage on ad orientem. Ratzinger writes, a more important objection is of the practical order. Ought we really to be rearranging everything all over again? Nothing is more harmful to the liturgy than a constant activism. Remember, right? Even if it seems to be for the sake of genuine renewal. So that's, don't just turn around um, necessarily, is what he's saying. And he'll explain. I see a solution in a suggestion that comes from the insights of Eric Peterson. Facing east, as we heard, was linked with the sign of the Son of Man, with the cross, which announces the Lord's second coming. That is why, very early on, the east was linked with the sign of the cross, where a direct common turning toward the east is not possible. The cross can serve as the interior east of faith. It should stand in the middle of the altar and be the common point of focus for both priest and praying community. In this way, we obey the ancient call to prayer, conversati ad Dominum, turn toward the Lord. In this way, we look together at the one whose death tore the veil of the temple, the one who stands before the Father for us and encloses us in his arms in order to make us the new and living temple. Now, here's the notice here when Pope Benedict promulgated Summorum Pontificum, a lot of people have said, and I'm right there with them, I guess. Um, I wish Pope Benedict had just reformed the missal, right? Um, and legislated on the Ars Celebrandi, right? But here's the thing: he gives this is why he didn't, and this is why he did Summorum Pontificum. It's this line right here. So that when you read the man long enough, you start to understand why he does what he does, or why he did what he did. But he says right here, nothing is more harmful to the liturgy than a constant activism, even if it seems to be for the sake of genuine renewal. So his compromise was Summorum Pontificum, right? But also when it comes to Ad Orientem, his compromise was if you can do it, do it. And that's good. We should move in that direction. But if you don't, if we don't want to just change everything all over again, then put the crucifix in front of the priest so that the congregation and the priest can look at the crucifix. He calls it the interior east, right? So you maintain that east posture even in the face of a situation that's not ideal. So I hope that helps. So I covered a lot here. I wanted to balance things out, and I'll do more videos on some of these topics separately. I appreciate everybody watching. Thank you for listening to me ramble on and read from books that I spend my time reading. I can't do any of this, you know, uh, long term and as much if I don't get support. So I strongly appreciate anyone who's willing to give like $5, even $1, a month. I don't care. You can become a channel member on YouTube. You can become a Patreon member, subscriber, and so that really helps. Thank you, Kriya. I appreciate it. All right. So make sure you support us at patreon.com/the Logos Project. Thank you all so much for your time and for sharing with me the theology of Pope Benedict XVI and calling out the church to be more centered on Christ in the liturgy and less compromising with the world, but rather to witness to the world. Thank you all and good night.